Welcome, Jerry, to the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
So first of all, tell us a bit how you got interested in the voice phenomenon.
Well, it started years ago when I was in undergraduate school, and what I hated about psychology was that, unlike engineering or any other, discipline, you couldn't verify for yourself what they were saying. You had to take for granted that everything they were saying was true, because there's no way to get into a psych hospital or a mental health center or any kind of formal institution that held the mentally ill. You couldn't get in there. You can't just walk in the door and go, hey, I want to study this. I want to see if this is true. So here's 4 years of having to deal with, and I didn't trust authority. That was a big thing behind. I mean, I never fully trusted authority. So here they were teaching all this stuff. And the first thing that hit me, I remember in undergraduate school, was a paper that a psychologist wrote that we were told to read. And basically what it said was that if two schizophrenics encountered each other with the same hallucination, both of them thought they were King George, this psychologist was saying that one of them would have to give away and change his identity to some other fictional character. And I'm like, what kind of sense does that make? They're two crazy guys and they both think they're King George. I mean, why would one of them have to change? It didn't make any sense. So I had no way to disprove that or prove it or anything, because, like I said, they have you locked out of clinical populations. In the 40 years I've been working with psychiatric patients, I've never once seen a researcher in any of the institutions that I worked at actually looking into what was actually happening. It's like they're programmed in graduate school and they're released with these fabrications that the psychiatric mafia and psychology has put into their heads. So I logged that one in, and one day I was doing rounds on one of the big psychiatric wards, and a new guy had appeared, a new patient had appeared, and it was my job to kind of size up all the new psych patients that were coming on the unit, see what they're going to do, how they were reacting, how they were behaving, and seeing if they needed medications. So I came up to this guy, and he was arguing with somebody. He was carrying on a vehement argument, but it was like listening to one side of a telephone conversation, where he was arguing with somebody, but he was arguing in full sentences, and he was upset, and he's walking around arguing with somebody, but it's like listening to one side of a telephone conversation. So I kind of crept up on him and trying to listen to what he was saying, and then he saw me, and I walked up and said, hey, I'm Jerry, I'm the psych for this unit. I haven't met you before. What's your name? And he looks at me and he goes, I'm Jesus Christ. And I thought for a second, and then I looked him straight in the eye and I went, no, you can't be Jesus Christ, because I am. And I'm waiting for his response, to see, is what they told me 10 years ago true? I mean, if two people with the same delusion encounter each other, well, one of them have to change. So is he going to change his delusion? Because and I was adamant about it. I said, no, I am. You can't be. And he sat there and he thought for a minute, and he looked around, and then he looks at me and he goes, okay, we can both be Jesus Christ. And he strolls off. I'm like, okay, what else did they lie to me about? The first time. And then later I found out that 80% of what psychologists publish is not replicable. So that it can't be repeated. So only 20% of what they publish holds any water. And I saw when I was in graduate school that it's publish or perish. It doesn't matter what they're publishing as long as they're publishing something. So that kind of dampened my trust for what they were putting out. And then it came to psychiatry. So I was working at the biggest state hospital in the world at that time. I mean, there were like 10,000 patients there when I first arrived in Milledgeville, Georgia. And one of the things I'd been told was that schizophrenics were schizophrenic because they had a chemical brain imbalance. That's what they were teaching in graduate school. And they were also teaching that they had some genetic upset, but something was wrong with their brain. I mean, their brains were broken. And there was some kind of chemical imbalance there. So they're teaching this in all institutions. And this is pushed by Big Pharma. And they want everybody to believe that. So one thing I noticed is that none of the psychiatrists, before they dished out any of their medications, took any kind of samples. They didn't take any blood work. They didn't do any kind of test. They didn't do anything to determine what the chemical balance of the brain was. And they just kind of got a dartboard and just mentally, oh, well, okay, we'll start them on this antipsychotic medication and see what happens. It was like a dartboard. They were spinning a wheel. It was like, based on their experience, maybe this isn't. But there was no measurement. And I'm thinking, like, well, how are they going to know what's out of balance or by how much if they don't have any tests? And I looked into it, and no tests exist for that. There is not a single test to verify any of the diagnoses. And I think, what is it, 250 something now in the DSM-5, the Bible for psychiatry. There's not a single medical lab test to verify any of those diagnoses. They were all made up by psychiatrists. Standard Oil and all these big multimillionaires kind of took over the medical schools. So they bought off the U.S. Congress to make laws that the only doctors that could be licensed would practice pharmacology. There's no other treatment. All the others were outlawed. The electrical therapy, the naturopathy, all the other forms of treatment were considered garbage. And the only valid form of treatment that they had enacted by law was, pharmacology, treating people with drugs. So they virtually put out of business all the medical schools except for, a couple of the big ones over here, making those laws that if they didn't teach pharmacology, they weren't licensed as a doctor. And the big pharma was behind this. So all the medical schools had to teach, pharmacology. All the others were outlawed and made illegal. Any doctor who referred a patient to any other form of treatment was risking their license back then. And since then, big pharma and the medical industry has taken over the medical schools. So the medical schools are basically teaching what big pharma wants them to teach. They're providing huge grants. They're taking money if they don't. And they're still publishing lies. They're still, if you read their advertisements, they're still saying that schizophrenia is due to a chemical brain imbalance. Well, they have no proof of that whatsoever. Matter of fact, it's been disproved over and over and over again. But what they want to do is sell their toxic drugs. They want no interference with their office visits. They want no interference with their sale of drugs. And between psychiatry and big pharma together, they're making $447 billion a year selling these toxic antipsychotic drugs that they put out on the market and are selling around the world. And those drugs don't cure anything. They don't cure schizophrenia. What they do is they're major tranquilizers, and they'll weaken the voices. But in virtually all cases, they don't get rid of them. So when the people stop taking those drugs, the voices reappear.
So what are the side effects of those drugs?
Oh, they're horrible. I have them listed here. Let me see if I can find them. Dry mouth, sexual dysfunction. You feel like you're. It's like a combination of being nervous and drugged down at the same time. They're some of the most dangerous and toxic drugs used in medical practice today. But the psychiatrists won't tell the patients that. They can cause permanent, matter of fact, they shrink your brain, and they can cause permanent neurological damage with extended use. So where they started first finding this was with mental patients in the psych hospitals when they did autopsies. They found that their brains were shrunk, and the legitimate researchers would publish that, and then big pharma and the psychiatric mafia jumped up screaming, no, it's not the drugs, it's the schizophrenia doing that. It's not our drugs. So some other researchers started giving these antipsychotic drugs to animals, to monkeys. And they found that their brains were shrunk and their peripheral nervous systems were rotted out also. So they proved it. The psychiatric mafia and the big drug companies, they blocked that research. And they wouldn't publish it. They wouldn't put it out there. The toxic effects of these drugs, it's not, you can call them side effects, but what they are is poisonous, toxic effects of these drugs. And what they do is they cause muscle rigidity. They slow your movements. It's like your brain has got syrup on it. There's involuntary muscle jerking. There's muscle tremor. There's restlessness and a feeling as if one needs to be in constant motion. There's tardive dyskinesia, which is actually the neurological damage taking place. It's the involuntary movements of the face and the mouth and the lips and the arms and legs and tongue darting where your tongue darts out. There's neuroleptic malignant syndrome. It's a life-threatening condition that's characterized by muscle rigidity, fever, sweating, irregular heartbeat, blood pressure changes, altered mental status, confusion, disorientation. These are all side effects of these crappy drugs. So dizziness, weight gain, sexual dysfunction, cardiac effects, hypotension, dry mouth, constipation, nausea, vomiting, headache. These aren't fun drugs to take, and they're not abusable. Nobody in their right mind is going to abuse these things. Go over the border, and you can get these drugs in the pharmacy over the counter. So if you've already been prescribed them, you don't have to keep going back to the psychiatrist to get them again. You can walk in and say, I want this, and nobody in their right mind would take these things. They're awful drugs. But psychiatry and big pharma want to keep control of that. And like I said, between psychiatry and big pharma, they're making $447 billion a year on office visits and the sale of these toxic drugs. But they're so awful, schizophrenics don't want to stay on them. It's the voices that drive schizophrenia. Psychiatry has gone as far as to label the voices a thought disorder. That's it. They stopped there. And then what they declared was the voices are hallucinations. So look what they've done with that proclamation. And they have no research to back that. None. Just in their infinite arrogance, they just stand up and go, yeah, the voices are hallucinations due to a broken brain because they say so. There is no broken brain. They have not been able to find any chemical imbalance in the brain of schizophrenics. They have not been able to find any genetic marker for schizophrenia. So all this, what they're doing is they're desperate to search for a physical cause for schizophrenia so they can keep selling drugs, these toxic drugs that merely suppress the symptoms. And what's even more disastrous is that when these symptoms start to occur, they will add other drugs. So they'll tell the patient there is no cure. You've got to take these awful drugs for the rest of your life. That's the only treatment there is. And these are the high priest of psychiatry. So here's voices start appearing in the patient's head, and they're getting in trouble, and they're telling them to do awful things. And then they go to the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist tells them, well, your brain is broken due to a chemical imbalance, and there's nothing you can do about it except take these toxic drugs. And they're expensive. I think it's close to $800 to $1,000 a month for them to stay sane if they don't have insurance by taking these drugs. They could keep large populations under control by drugging them silly with these things. So they could reduce staff. Look at what the typical schizophrenic goes through. These voices appear in their heads that are intrusive thoughts, and they're not good. They're telling them to, hit people, cuss people out, leave, isolate, to do all these kind of antisocial things. And they're like, what's going on here? Sometimes they start gradually, sometimes they start suddenly. But they go to a psychiatrist because they're the high priest of mental health. They've taken over the mental health system. And look what they're told. Your brain is broken. There is no cure. You must take these awful drugs for the rest of your life, and you must keep coming to me to get your prescriptions filled. When your prescription runs out, you have to come back here so I can check and see that you're adjusted properly, or you need some other kind of antipsychotic. So it's a scam that way. You can't get these things over the counter here in the U.S., and I imagine you can't get them over the counter over there because the drug companies have taken care of that. They want you to pay through the nose for these drugs, and they want the pharmacist involved, and they want the psychiatrist to have their cut. Schizophrenics hate these medications. That virtually at one time or another, all of them go off those medications, and then they revert back into a psychotic state. I'd wonder, well, why are they doing that? Do they want to go crazy? Do they want to, do they enjoy the psychotic state? Why do they all keep going off their medications? So schizophrenia is a very self-destructive disease. It's not a disease, it's a condition. They want you to believe it's a disease. The voices are energetic entities. They're not hallucinations. They run very fixed patterns. And if they're running fixed patterns, they can't be hallucinations. Hallucinations don't run fixed patterns. They don't understand that people are spiritual beings, that we're not just physical beings, we're spiritual beings at hearts, and that these bodies are spacesuits. But the real us is a spiritual being inside this body. And psychiatry is just struggling to make schizophrenia a physical disease that they can drug. But it's not. The closest they've ever come was saying it was a thought disorder. Now, schizophrenics get very confused about what's going on with them. Society believes that thoughts are who you are. I mean, if you have a thought going through your head, it belongs to you. I mean, where else could it come from? But if you think a second, you step back and you look at those thoughts and you listen to those thoughts, and you're sitting there concentrating on them coming in and out of your mind, who's the one listening? Who's the one watching? So the first misnomer is you're not your thoughts. And your thoughts are not who you are. You are the one who's listening and watching them. Now, what the schizophrenic voices do is they invade the patient's mind, and they call them intrusive thoughts. They just barge in there, and they sound just like the patient's normal thoughts. That there's no change in intonation. There's no, it doesn't sound different. There's no harsh, there's nothing like that. They sound just like the thousands of other thoughts that go through the patient's head every day.
So it's not really a voice per se. It's more an intrusive thought.
Well, it is a voice because it's talking to them, but it is an intrusive thought also. It barges its way in there, and everybody's experienced those. Where you're walking down the street and all of a sudden, you get this intrusive thought to punch this guy or beat the crap out of this one or smash your car into this something or other, or, drive off the road or it's just something that startles you. It's a thought that comes into your mind and just startles you because you would never act on it. It doesn't belong to you. It's foreign to your identity, but it barges in there and it tells you to do something totally ridiculous that you would never do. So that's kind of what it's like, but with schizophrenics, it's happening all the time. And since we're taught that all our thoughts are ours, the schizophrenics are like, well, that must be me, because who else could it be? But these thoughts are fighting against their intention for themselves. So there's two different intentions set up. The intention of what the voices want them to do, and their intention of what they don't want to do. So a lot of times at the state hospital, you'd see patients arguing with the voices against doing something that the voices wanted them to do. There was one lady who, the voices were telling her to leave the hospital grounds. And she was arguing with them, going, I don't want to leave the hospital grounds, as she was walking off toward away from the hospital. So, psychiatry is insisting that the voices are hallucinations, but they run a series of patterns. So after study, and psychiatry won't study them. And look what they've done by doing that. So by declaring that the voices are hallucinations and publishing this in all the journals, in all the medical schools, and cranking out thousands of psychiatrists who've been brainwashed to think that the voices are hallucinations without any research backing whatsoever. Who in their right mind is going to study a hallucination? Well, you got two sources for them. It is your past experiences and what you've learned about the world and society and the people around you. And then you've got all these unacceptable thoughts or insults or tragedies or traumas that are packed inside that you don't want to face. So those are buried. And when they're set off, there's an explosion. It's like somebody comes up that says something to you and it triggers you, and you react. You don't even think about it. So you got that stuff going on, and then you got these entities that are putting thoughts in your mind also. Every thought that is negative against yourself or anybody else does not come from you. You are a pure energetic being, and that energy is clouded and sucked up by these negative structures that have been learned or put around it.